Welcome to session 8 in our series of studies in the prophets. And today we plunge into exile with Ezekiel. We've been teetering on the edge of it, and now we are fully there with the prophet Ezekiel. So just recalling the typical phrase of the prophets, the word of the Lord came to me. There you are. I started looking for it in Ezekiel and I just gave up and used my electronic concordance that told me there were another 56 times after that. Very typical of Ezekiel. Symbolic activities, a brick and iron plate depicting the siege of Jerusalem. He uses a sword to shave his hair and burn it to dramatize the destruction of the city. Claps hands and stamping feet to show the anger of the Lord at idols, etc. Woe to you, a phrase in many of the prophets, here in Ezekiel, and the covenant. Ezekiel has a number of things to say about the covenant, as we shall see. All very typical of the way prophets operate. We're holding in mind the question of forthtelling, speaking to the present situation, and foretelling, looking into the future. And again, like we saw with Jeremiah 31 last week, the new covenant, so with Ezekiel 37 this week, the valley of dry bones and the spirit, the breath being breathed into them, those kinds of passages are both forthtelling to the present situation, but also have been used by Christians as a sense of foretelling. So we'll bear that in mind. The justice of God and the mercy of God, both issues, and for Ezekiel in the midst of the exile, both considering how exile is a punishment for the idolatry and injustice practiced in Israel, but also the mercy of God with them in exile and promising to bring them back to the land. So those issues are still to the fore. Jeremiah and Ezekiel both lived at this crucial turning point in the history of Israel. The southern kingdom has fallen. Judah has gone into exile. Ezekiel was actually exiled 12 years because the Babylonian, it wasn't just a single incident that caused the exile. There were battles and wars being waged, and the Babylonians came south and then went back north and came back down again. Ezekiel was captured with a group of people in the year 599 under King Nebuchadnezzar and taken into exile. He had his first vision as a prophet. You remember Ezekiel was a priest. He was called to prophesy. His first vision occurred 6 years after he went into exile. And in his prophetic activity, he addresses both those who are with him in exile in Babylon and also those who still remain in Judah, both up to 587 and even those that were there afterwards. So he was active as a prophet for many decades. And as we'll see today, a key issue for Ezekiel, who is there in exile in Babylon, is whether God, the Lord God, continues to be the God of the people of Judah, even though they are in exile in Babylon. They do not have their temple. They cannot practice their regular religious rituals. They do not have their land, their ancestral lands that have been so important to them. So Ezekiel offers a development in understanding that God is continuing to care for the people, even when they don't have this land and don't have this temple. And we'll see the very distinctive and perhaps peculiar way in which Ezekiel promotes that point of view. So we're going to launch into his opening chapter, which is quite different from the call of Jeremiah and also the call of Isaiah and the call of other prophets. Each prophet has a very distinctive kind of vision that impels them into prophecy.
It might help you at this point to have Ezekiel 1 in front of you so you can appreciate this vision, because John hasn't produced it completely in your notes.
Long.
It is long, but having a look at the things that you might pick up to help answer those questions. We'll just have a little look at some things. Now, you might notice that there's a wind that comes up and where it comes from. and there's a cloud with brightness. There is fire flashing, and there's noise. You might think about what that reminds you of. And you might notice that it's very hazy as a vision as it begins. It takes a while before it actually forms into what Ezekiel is talking about. So we have, as the vision progresses, we have a merging. We've got this sort of outline of a chariot coming through, and we've got bright light. And as you all know, it's not permitted to make images of God. So you'll find that if you look at the Hebrew in this, Ezekiel doesn't say this was the image of something that represents God. He uses the term something like, and he uses it many, many, many times. So the vision is something like the chariot. It's something like a chariot. It's something like an animal. It's something like whatever it is he's describing. So he's careful not to actually label these figures as actual things. They're just semblances of animals and things. And the Hebrew word is demut, which is likeness or appearance. So he uses it 10 times in this particular vision. Have a think about the 4 living creatures and what they might be based on, and how they're described, and where they what might else be found in the Old Testament. And also think of Ezekiel's position, where he actually is, and whether or not the culture of Babylon has influenced him. And John's also mentioned is, how do you worship a God in exile that lived in an ark in a temple that has now been destroyed? And you might think about the style of the, if you like, the carriage of this particular vision that Ezekiel has. I don't want to say heaps and heaps about it, because I want you to think about it in your breakout groups and think about those questions that John has put in here. Is what do you think the significance is? Where do you think these things are coming from? Where is he drawing on to get these particular things? And what is it symbolizing? So think about the 4 figures and the wheels of the chariot, and think about the noise and the actual things that are happening around the vision and where they might come from. Hello again. How did you get on examining Ezekiel and where he got some of his weirdo ideas from? Gee, there's a lot of silence.
Oh, there's an old saying, where there's a will, there's a way.
Where there's a wheel, there's a way. No, that's a bad pun.
And let's face it, we sort of look at the overarching view that it's about a vision of God not confined to the ark in the temple, and left it at that.
Right.
Well, that's right. Had anyone worked out why it's got wheels?
Not really.
2 Star Wars movies ago, there was a robot that was just a complete circle, and the wheel is a very perfect form. And yeah, attaching it to something else is tricky, but you know, you think of the hip socket.
Well, they would have been conquered by wheels, very strong wheels.
Strong-willed people.
Strong-willed.
Oh, dear me.
Wheeled.
Who was that? Who was that?
It's Bill. It's
Bill. He just keeps wheeling them out. Oh.
That's right.
The wheels are certainly a symbol of mobility and
Yes.
ability to move quickly, and it makes a specific emphasis on moving in different directions, and that the spirit of the creatures was in the wheels, which, if we're looking at the notion that it's talking about God not being confined to one particular place, it's a bit disjointed, but yes.
Like that.
That's absolutely right, Judy. That's nailed it. It demonstrates for the first time we have in the Hebrew Bible that Yahweh has grown wheels. And this is highly significant, that Yahweh has this chariot. It means that he can move from the confines of the temple that's been destroyed and go to where the people are. You probably didn't realize this when you read this vision, how highly significant this is. This is equated to the invention of fire and you know, learning how to shoot people with a gun kind of stuff. It's really exceptional that we no longer have Yahweh confined in the ark, but he's got wheels and he can go in any direction and he can move around. So he can be, so Ezekiel is saying, fear not, your God has moved here. So that is the significance of the wheels. It shows that Yahweh is mobile. He's no longer confined. That's a funny kind of idea for us.
But it must have been, if they were, for people who thought that God had been carried in the ark to Jerusalem and was there, and that was where God was, to be moved into exile would have been horrific, that, you know, separated from God with no hope of getting back.
That's right.
This would have been an incredibly hopeful.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, it looks really strange to us, but it's a very potent and very significant image we have here. Sharon.
Walter suggests that the concept of chariot, he calls it Merkava, and I've probably said that wrong. To moderns, it may seem like a bizarrely composite hovering helicopter.
Yes, that's right. And of course, they've got wings, which means they can probably fly as well. But the wheels are there to indicate that mobility, because the idea of Yahweh up on his chariot and his wings in the heaven may not be quite as concrete as what Ezekiel's trying to present here as a vision of hope, that God can be with them with exile. What about the four creatures and their faces? Anyone have any thoughts on that? Why those creatures? Why four of them? Why are they there?
There was a comment in our group between Sue and Matt, I think, talking about how very like this was in Revelation.
Yes.
Which didn't quite answer the question, but we looked at the fact there was a human, a bull, a calf, and a eagle.
A lion.
A lion, thank you.
Yeah, not a bull and a calf. You can only have one of them.
One of those, yes.
All written long before Revelation.
That's right. Revelation nicked Ezekiel, not vice versa.
The other way around, yes.
Yeah.
And we spoke of how Irenaeus used the four creatures as a basis for the gospel. And you can see Ezekiel saying, okay, the gospels are going to read, I have to have four beasts for the four gospels. No. But
that's right. That's where the gospels get their symbols from. It's directly from this vision. But that doesn't answer where Ezekiel got them from.
No.
Robert also suggests that they represent the four faces of Marduk, the god of the Babylonians. But
well, I think Ezekiel probably has been influenced by his culture. I'm going to show you a picture now. This statue here is an ancient Babylonian statue, and you can see that it's got straight legs, it's got cloven hooves, it's got wings, it's got a face, and some of them this is a human face, but some of them did have creatures' faces. So it's thought that Ezekiel may be basing, in part at least, his visions on these particular kind of statues you find in temples and at gateways and town gates, etc., in Babylon. So it's quite possible that he was influenced. He'd been there some years before he had those visions. But apart from this vision in Babylon, is God ever described as an eagle?
Yeah.
Yes, he is. Is he ever described as a lion?
Yes.
Yes, he is. That's right. Is he described anywhere as being like an ox or having the strength of an ox? Yes, he is. So these characteristics are all drawn from the Old Testament. So you have the human being as it's kind of the mind of the thing, or its intelligence, or it's rational. Then you have the lion for its sovereignty, the ox for strength and diligence, and of course the eagle flies free in the sky and it's very agile. So they probably represent these characteristics that Yahweh has been described as having through various metaphors of him, roaring like a lion, or, flying high like an eagle, etc. And you can find that, so they're not merely wild animals. they represent these characteristics of Yahweh. They can see in all directions. So we've got the first sense of God being omniscient and being able to see everything. They've got 4 wings, similar to the cherubim. The seraphim have 6, but they seem to have some similarities with the seraphim as well. So what about the noise and the thunder and the lightning and the smoke and the fire? Does that evoke anything with you?
Yeah, God.
Yes, Mount Sinai in particular. We find these manifestations of God on Mount Sinai. So everything about this vision screams God, Yahweh, Elohim, whatever you want to use to describe God, drawing on different things. The interesting thing about this, of course, is it's being, Ezekiel's writing this at the same time the priests are busy redacting and editing and writing up things like Genesis. So as John says, it would be interesting to do a study to have a look at how much Ezekiel is drawn on the creation stories too, and the Torah with how he puts his vision together.
Is there a version of the Bible? You got the red letter Bible for the New Testament, where in red everything that Jesus writes, but one that has got the different voices in different color print at all?
Not that I'm aware of, but that doesn't mean it's not out there, Sharon, because there's so many Bibles and people have done so many different things to them. It might exist. You'd have to go hunting for this. But Ezekiel's always been considered a bit strange, and I don't think that's an unreasonable way of looking at him. But you can see that in some ways it's a quite straightforward, if somewhat different, way of presenting these attributes of God. And of course, by putting the wheels on it, you've got a mobile God for the first time that's clearly mobile and has the capacity to be with the people and to see them and to move wherever they are. Is there any other comments?
We're actually going to jump to chapter 37 next. And in order to get there, we're going to look at the second video from the Bible Project. So the first minute or so is an overview of what's in the first part of Ezekiel, and then we'll focus on the latter part. So in the interest of time, we're just jumping over various things.
The rest of the book is designed to explore Ezekiel's vision of hope, first for Israel, then for the nations, and then for all of creation. The hope for Israel begins with God promising to raise up a new David, a future messianic king, who's going to be the kind of leader that Israel needed but never got. And this new Israel, who's going to come under the messianic king's rule, is going to be a transformed people. God's going to deal with the heart of their problem of rebellion by giving them new hearts. It's just like Moses promised at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. God says he's going to remove their hard hearts and send his spirit into his people to give them new, soft hearts that can love and obey their God. And this idea gets developed in the next strange vision. Ezekiel sees a huge valley filled up with dry human bones and skeletons, and God tells him that it's an image, a metaphor for Israel's spiritual state. So their rebellion against God, it resulted in exile and the literal death of many people, but it was also a metaphorical death of their covenant relationship. And God tells Ezekiel that his spirit is coming to bring his people back to life. And so this wind comes, and it causes all of the bones to stand up, and it fills them with breath and life, and then skin grows over the bones, and then all of a sudden Ezekiel sees all of these new humans standing in front of him. Now, this vision, it's recalling the story about the creation of humans in Genesis chapter 2, where God made humans out of dirt and divine breath. And so Israel and all humanity have rebelled, resulting in death. And so the only hope is that God would perform a new act of creation and remake humans in such a way that they can truly live in a relationship of love with God and with each other. And so after God is going to deal with the evil that's in the hearts of his own people, some questions still remain unresolved. Like, what about the evil that's still rampant out there among the nations? And what about the future of God's dwelling place in the temple? And this is what the final 2 sections of the book are about. So first come chapters 38 and 39, and they promise God's final defeat of evil among the nations, which gets personified by a ruler who's named Gog from the land of Magog. Now, this name is derived from a genealogy of ancient kingdoms and lands from Genesis chapter 10, and it referred to powerful nations from the distant past. And so Ezekiel picks up this ancient biblical name as an image of any and all violent kingdoms. And so we find that Gog gets allied with 7 nations that come from all 4 directions of the compass, is clearly an image that represents all of the nations. And this also helps us understand why Ezekiel describes Gog with images that he used earlier in the book to describe the king of Tyre and the king of Egypt, Pharaoh. For Ezekiel, Gog is an amalgam of all of the worst, most violent people in the Bible. Gog is the archetype of human rebellion against God. The basic story in these chapters is that Gog resists God's plan to restore his people. And so just like Pharaoh in the Exodus story, Gog comes to destroy the people. But God unleashes his justice on Gog, and it's in a flurry of scenes that don't actually make very good literal sense if you read them in sequence. Because first, Gog and his armies are consumed by an earthquake, but then they're consumed by fire 2 different times. And then after that, God comes and strikes Gog and his army down in the fields where they lay unburied for months. It's clear that these scenes are full of symbol and imagery. Ezekiel has pulled out his entire poetic tool set here to describe how God is determined to finally defeat human evil that has ruined his world. And it's so that he can pave the way for a new creation. And so once evil is finally dealt with among the nations, the last section of the book describes how God's presence is going to one day return to his people and his temple to bring cosmic restoration. So Ezekiel first gets this long, elaborate vision of a new temple and a new city. He's given this heavenly tour guide who shows him around the new temple complex, and it's much larger and more majestic than even Solomon's temple. There's a new altar, new priests, a whole new system of worship. And then after this elaborate tour, God's glorious throne chariot that he saw back in his first vision comes back, and it enters the new temple. Now, the meaning of these temple visions has been the source of debate for a long, long time. So some Christian and Jewish readers believe that this vision will be fulfilled literally one day, and that these chapters offer the actual blueprints of the new temple that will be built when the Messiah returns and brings God's kingdom. But many other Jewish and Christian readers think that this vision, like all of Ezekiel's other visions, is full of symbols, and they depict the reality of God's presence returning to his people in the Messianic kingdom, but not necessarily in the form of an actual building. Whichever view you take, it's important that Ezekiel never calls the city Jerusalem, and chapters 47 and 48 show why. Ezekiel sees this tiny stream pouring out of the temple threshold and steps, and then it quickly becomes this raging river, and then it flows out of the temple and the city into the desert, into one of the most desolate places on planet Earth, the Dead Sea Valley. And then that river, it leaves behind it a trail of trees and life, and then the Dead Sea gets transformed into a living sea that's teeming with plants and animals. All of this imagery comes from the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. And we see just how cosmic Ezekiel's vision really is. God's plan has always been to restore all humanity and all creation back to his life-giving presence. And so the book ends with the name of this garden city. The Lord is there. And so Ezekiel's visions come to a close, full of hope for a new future, new humans living in a new world that's animated by God's life-giving spirit. It's a world permeated with God's love and justice. And that's what the book of Ezekiel is all about.
So were we to do 2 sessions on Ezekiel, we would have looked more at what comes before chapter 33, because Ezekiel is a classic prophet like the others. He preaches oracles of doom and judgment and punishment on Israel and indeed on other nations around it. But it's the latter part of the book where the visions of hope, as you can see from the video, become dominant. And earlier prophets had, of course, had elements of hope in what they were saying, but for Jeremiah and Ezekiel, in the midst of the exile, that hope looms large. So Ezekiel says again and again that the hand of the Lord was upon him to be a prophet. He says in chapter 3 that the Spirit lifted him up. Indeed, he says that the Spirit entered me in 3:24. So he presents to us the classic view of prophecy that we have from this distance, that God grabs hold of a person, the hand of the Lord is upon me, gives visions through the Spirit, and indeed the Spirit enters into and inspires the words that are spoken. And that's all brought into dramatic, symbolic presentation in chapter 37, where Ezekiel sees the valley of dry bones and God putting sinews and flesh and skin on those bones, and then in a phrase that really evokes Genesis. In Genesis, when God created humanity, he breathed the breath of life into human beings. Here in this valley of dry bones, after having enfleshed the bones, God breathes into the bodies so that they live. And in fact, Ezekiel then says that God says, I will put my spirit within you and you shall live, and I will place you on your own soil. So there's that immediate forthtelling to the people, the exiled people of Israel, that they will return. There will be new life, and that new life does mean a return to the land. So it's a vision that is indeed a metaphor, but it's a message for the exiles in Ezekiel's own time. So the questions for us to ponder in this next group are, what do you think that the vision stands for in Ezekiel's times? And what do you think that it might be saying to us in our own time, particularly since this is a favorite part of the Old Testament in Christian churches, to evoke the notion of resurrection. But if you can have a think about what does the metaphor stand for in Ezekiel's time, what does the metaphor say to us in our own time in this next group, please?
So this very much loved passage, and it's one of the few places in Ezekiel we actually get on the lectionary, the Valley of the Dry Bones. So what did you think it might mean for the church today?
Encouragement for renewal, particularly in parishes that are dying, and some of them, I think, are dying very rapidly.
Would everyone agree with Piers that it's encouragement for renewal?
Yes, but
yes,
it needs to go further. There's this picture of the dry bones getting sinews and then muscles and then skin, but it's only as God's Spirit comes into them that they actually live. So it's more than just doing all the things that the church growth people say. It's about being open to the Spirit working and possibly calling us to do something quite different.
Yes. Yes. That's the way I see it too. And I think it may be even beyond, because there's many bodies in this vision. It might be beyond just individual parishes or churches to the whole church looking, at renewal. And what does it mean to have the breath of God within? So I think it can be small vision, and it can be a very large, all-encompassing kind of vision for the church as we know it anyway.
So we certainly didn't like the idea that this was about resurrection at the end of times. We felt it had it's common. It was talking about things here and now and things in Ezekiel's time.
Yeah, it's very unlikely to be about bodily resurrection. I think it is a metaphor. Ezekiel's rather fond of them, and it is symbolic, and it is about God breathing new life into humanity in this concept of a new covenant and a renewal through the Spirit. And this is where a comparison with Genesis would be interesting, because of course Adam and Eve live when God breathes God's Spirit into them. And that's when they become nephesh, that is a living being, infused with the spirit. And it seems that this is what Ezekiel is doing here. So it's not about recreation, it's about resurrection, it's about creation.
Oh, it's interesting. Elizabeth and I were talking while you were talking, and I looked up the lectionary. This passage appears in the lectionary in Lent 5 in Year A, and the gospel passage that's given in Lent 5 Year A is chapter 11 of John, the resurrection of the raising of Lazarus. So the lectionary is actually pushed us in the direction that you didn't want to go, Judy.
Yes.
Yeah. Although Lazarus was resurrected into life here and now rather than in
Yes,
into
true.
life.
Yes, that's right.
I think it's just that that we you don't have to push it that way.
No, you
No.
don't.
And the other place, of course, it appears in the lectionary is at Pentecost. There's a number of messages here for the church, really, but how you actually apply that is an interesting one because, you know, how do you make the Spirit renew people?
How does God make the Spirit?
Well, I'm asking
How
that
do we
question
tap
with
into
my
it?
tongue in my cheek, you know, and even if God sends the Spirit, do people necessarily recognize it?
No, that's the trouble.
Yeah.
I remember talking with a friend of mine at the time when the Toronto blessing was happening.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes.
Breaking down in laughter. And she said, you know, if the church was more open to listening to God, God would not have to manifest God's self in such extreme ways in order for us to listen and pay attention. And I went, yes.
Well, I think we're very comfortable, especially when we think of some of the prayers we pray that are really dangerous prayers. You know, if we're praying at Pentecost for the Spirit to come, what does that mean? Do we actually expect the Spirit to come? And my answer is probably not. And if the Spirit actually did manifest in some strange way, we'd probably freak out. So it's worth considering, what are we praying for and what does it look like and how do we respond to it? Because when we do this stuff, it's a very rote exercise often.
And sadly, even if the Spirit is manifest in a very ordinary sort of way, you might say, in comparison to these visions, we still don't recognise it. We still don't want to take the ordinary and see God and the Spirit active in the ordinary. So I think we're a pretty sad bunch of people.
Yeah, we need a bit of practice, I think, in spirit recognising.
In our group, we looked at verse 14, and Alta says, I will put my breath in you, you shall live, and I will set you on your soil. Now, yes, for the Israelites, that of course was Israel. So looking at, you didn't miss anything. I just stopped as soon as you said I was frozen. Where we are, the seed planted, what we are growing, what the Spirit is doing. And we looked at, Kumar, do you want to say something about for the people have been displaced, or Henrietta?
Well, I'm not really geared up for such a public audience, but I would say anyway.
I'm sure you'll manage, Kumar.
We are looking at this as something that happened in history for the Jewish people. But I was thinking this story, for us in Australia, living quite cozily, we might read it that way. But for some people in Sri Lanka or Bangladesh or Sudan, it is a present day story.
And we don't remember that well either.
No, we don't.
You're right, Kumar. We sit in comfortable Australia and we don't remember these things or think about these things unless they're intruded on us in really, you know, dramatic ways. Okay, we better move on now.
So Ezekiel, the prophet, the visionary, the master of symbolism, gives us this wonderful passage to inspire and stimulate and encourage us, just as he was doing to the people of his own time. But we are going to jump back into the earlier section of Ezekiel, because as well as being inspiring and stimulating, Ezekiel offers some words, some images that are challenging, threatening, disturbing. He has seen a human figure that sat with him and describe the great abominations that the house of Israel are committing to drive me far from my sanctuary, says God. God says, I will act in wrath, my eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. Though they are crying in my hearing with a loud voice, I will not listen to them. And so in chapter 10, Ezekiel sees the glory of the Lord leaving the temple, taken up by the cherubim, taken away from the earth. And the glory of the Lord is away from all humanity until the glory of the Lord returns to fill the temple in chapter 43. So this is back to the troubling portrayal of God as wrathful, angry, punishing, deserting. And as Elizabeth's going to take us through in chapter 16, a very disturbing saga.
Again, it may help you to have chapter 16 of Ezekiel in front of you, so you can have a look at what is being described. Often the prophets, as we've looked at, have used imagery of Israel as some sort of unfaithful bride or wife, and we've met Hosea, who was ordered to marry a woman who was going to be unfaithful, and that was meant to be symbolic of what Israel was doing with Yahweh. This one is particularly gruesome, I think, in its description there. So we start in verse 4, on the day you were born, your cord was not cut, nor were you washed with water to make you clean. You hadn't been rubbed with salt. So this is a good social scientific text here to tell us what happened to children who were newly born in this time in Israelite history. You weren't rubbed in salt or wrapped in cloths. No one looked on you with pity. You were thrown into the open field, for on that day you were born, you were despised. And that also tells us, if you've been seduced by the idea of the sanctity of life of the Old Testament, put it aside now, because this tells us babies were discarded and exposed, as is the word that's often used. And then, of course, Yahweh passes by and sees this abandoned baby kicking in its blood from birth, and says, live, and I made you grow, and you developed, you went to puberty, your breasts had formed, your hair had grown, you were stark naked, and I thought I fancied you, you were old enough for love, and then I threw my cloak over you. And we all know what that means, don't we? So, and then they have entered into this covenant. I bathed you with water and washed the blood from you. That is, you'll find that if you want to read Leviticus about after the first night of wedding, the elders would look for blood on the sheets to make sure that the woman was a virgin at the time. So I bathed you and washed you and put ointments on you and, you know, adorned you as my bride, basically. And then you went off and you became a prostitute. That is, you know, you went off and committed adultery and you did not stay faithful to me. So I find this a fairly grotesque image. That's just me talking about this baby that's been left abandoned to die in a field, and Yahweh says, well, you know, live. And then, you know, when this baby enters puberty and is stark naked, and we get some quite graphic descriptions here of what's happening, Yahweh says, all right, I'm going to take you as a wife. And then it goes into the woman cast as the whore, or Israel as the woman who is the whore. So I'm going to ask a question that's sort of only tangential to the text here. The metaphors used by this prophet, as with some others like Hosea, are very disrespectful of women. They portray them as both men's possessions and also as whores. And I want to ask the question, how does this biblical depiction of women feed the stereotype understandings of women that you get particularly in evangelical Christian society? So I want you to think about that in your groups this time. How has this kind of portrayal actually influenced how women are seen in not only in Christian society, but in our society as a whole? Well, how did you go with Ezekiel?
I love that last comment that came from our group. She was groomed.
She certainly was. From birth.
From birth.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it, Margaret.
I didn't put it. Jenny put it like that.
Yes, absolutely correct.
It's a very 20th century orientation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like if you go back to that time, it wouldn't have been in that. It would have been about developing a relationship. I think that we're overlaying a lot of modern value.
We are, but it's important we overlay it simply because of how this has been used. I mean, how it's been used in the church, and then how that's had a knock-on effect into society about how women are seen and treated.
I guess it for me, the parallel, a parallel is the attitude to slavery, which it's quite biblical that it's okay to have slaves as long as you treat them well, and yet we reject that. And it's quite biblical that wives have very little purpose other than to make a home and look after children. And yet
we don't reject that.
We don't. Well, it depends on who we are as to whether we reject that or not. There's a less widespread rejection of it in our society than there is the notion that slavery is wrong.
Yes. And there's also the sense of women as who are victims of things like rape. There's a lot of victim blaming still goes on because women are seen as wanting to attract men. You know, they've deliberately worn a provocative outfit, or they've been in a place that says they're available, or they've walked somewhere at night where they shouldn't be. And there's often not a lot of sympathy for the woman as victim. And it comes from this kind of biblical stuff where women were seen as something. I mean, Bill's right, of course. This is the time when there would have been arranged marriages and, you know, you would have taken concubines. You could have had more than one wife, particularly in Babylon. We know from Esther that, you know, she's one of many wives in a harem up there. And it is a very different time, but people have taken these images and they've applied them to women now. And if women complain about abuse in churches, even now, particularly in evangelical churches, they're seen as troublemakers. They're seen as bringing accusations against good men. They're seen as somehow asking for it, whatever it is that has happened to them. So we live on with this residual stuff, not just from Ezekiel, but it's come from a number of different places in our scriptures that's fed that view in society. Does anyone else have any other comment they want to make about that?
Just one small comment, and that is that really, so long as people continue to read the scriptures or the Bible literally, we really have a hard task to move away into the, you know, the more open reading, the bigger picture stuff, you might say. The literal reading keeps these images even subconsciously in people's minds, including our own. We're not free from it either.
No,
it's been a while since I've heard a sermon on Ezekiel as an exemplar of how women are treated.
Sorry, what was that, Bill, the first part?
Well, it's been a while since I've heard a sermon based on Ezekiel, which explores the way to treat women.
Well, has a sermon ever been preached on this particular passage?
Not in my life.
Not in my lifetime.
It's probably not in the lectionary.
It's not in the lectionary, though I do know someone who did do something like that. He saw it in a very different way to what I saw it. And he was a white evangelical male raised with a lot of privilege and told he was going to be the leader that would reform the uniting church. So his lens, if you like, through which he saw this passage was very different to the lens through which I saw this passage. And he thought it was perfectly okay to talk about this in the context of our society and pull it out of its own context. And I disagreed with that. So it still happens. So, and it's not so much people preaching on it, Bill, it's the concept that this is how women behave. that they're whores, that they dress to seduce people, that if they're a victim of something, then they must have asked for it. It's this concept of women. It is alive and well out there, which is why something like 3% of rape cases actually have a successful prosecution. Think about that.
And it's not the only biblical passage, and there are other
Others like it
that are more prominent in people's discourse. Yeah.
Why do you think Mary Magdalene's always described as a whore or prostitute? The text doesn't describe her like this. It's because of the influence of these sorts of beliefs and texts.
And I was thinking too that the book, the Anne Summers book, Damn Whores and God's Police, that the understanding of this is kind of reflected in secular understandings in Australia. You know, that you're either putting women on a pedestal as beautiful queens or prostitutes, and it's a really, well, it's incredibly stereotypical way of understanding and damaging, I'd say.
I think we don't really give enough credence or understanding to how much thinking subconsciously or unconsciously in our Western world has come from biblical teachings, even though not as many people go to church, but it all undergirds our Western culture. And that is, I don't think we realise just by how much that has happened. And if we do, we start to get a little bit angsty about it.
Yeah, I guess I would prefer to call it interpretations of biblical teachings, because often if you go back to the text and go, so what is the good news for these people here? You can actually find good news, even though, but the traditional interpretation often only offers condemnation and judgment. So you go, oh, I mean, that's my hermeneutic of suspicion. What is the good news for the people in this text?
Yeah, and sometimes, Judy, there isn't good news.
Sometimes there isn't.
In those texts, they're just being told they're about to get flattened and punished. So, you know, the good news maybe is after they're flattened and punished, God will forgive them and restore them somehow. But that's a very checkered kind of good news. They're being dished out by the prophets in particular. But Margaret's right. This sort of story has undergirded, and this image of women has really seeped into our society, and it's still a problem. We still have one woman a week being killed by their intimate partners. It's actually larger than one. It's 1 point something women a week. What are we doing about it? I would suggest to you, if one man a week was being killed by the intimate partners, something would be done. I'd suggest if one man a week was being eaten by a shark on a beach, we'd drain the ocean. Because it's a female, it's never seen as the same thing.
That's right.
And the only way that's going to change is if women actually argue against these interpretations and argue against this infiltration of the woman as someone who deserves what they get into our society. All right, I'll get off my soapbox now and I'll give it back to John.
So just to look at the last section of Ezekiel, a key issue, I said right at the beginning, for Ezekiel relates to whether God continues to be the God of the people of Judah who are in exile in Babylon. In chapter 11, he has indicated that some who were still in the land and hadn't been sent into exile said about the exiles, they've gone far from the Lord. This land is given to us for a possession, and God is no longer your God. You are no longer in relationship with God. Though I remove them far away among the nations, Ezekiel's rejoinder, speaking God's voice, though I scatter them among the countries, yet I have been a sanctuary to them for a little while in the countries where they have gone. Ezekiel disputes what the people back in Judah were saying and says God does not abandon the people in exile. And that explains then why we have these strange vision beginning in chapter 40 and stretching through to chapter 46. It's if chapter 37 has been a a reworking of the breathing of the breath into human beings of Genesis 2, if the chariot vision in chapter 1 has been a kind of another understanding of the creation of Genesis 1, then the temple vision in Ezekiel 40 to 46 is a reworking in Ezekiel's mind of all of the prescriptions that we had in Exodus and repeat further in Leviticus about the temple in Jerusalem. So just bear in mind that Ezekiel, we learned from the first verse, was a priest, but he is taken into exile. Ezekiel spends the whole of his adult life as a priest without a temple. He's a minister without a parish. He's an accountant without anyone's tax to do. I mean, so he is bereft, and in his spirit-filled state of communion with God, he begins to envisage that restoration will mean a new temple, and that the temple will look something like you have it in your notes. Oh no, I didn't put it on the screen. But one striking thing about Ezekiel's vision of the temple is that it is perfectly square. If you do the measurements of what's set out in Exodus, you'll find that it's rectangular, and indeed the Ark of the Covenant was carried and put into a rectangular area when it was carried around. No rectangles for Ezekiel, it is square. And so there's a bit of a conundrum here, because what he says does not cohere with the earlier prescriptions of the temple. There's a neat story that I found about the difference between what Ezekiel says and what the tradition in which he was raised, the priestly tradition of Exodus and Leviticus about the temple, how to deal with the differences. In the Talmudic period, the period in which the Talmud was being written in the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, Rabbi Hananiah ben Hezekiah is said to have burned 300 barrels of oil working at night, attempting to reconcile the differences between Ezekiel and the Torah so that Ezekiel might be accepted as sacred scripture. So that's a Jewish story about even then, before the Middle Ages, there were critical scholars at work trying to deal with the differences between different parts of Scripture. At any rate, the notion that there is a temple and that God will inhabit that temple again, and that God has not abandoned the exiles, presents a development in the understanding of God. God is not just the tribal God of the Israelites bound to the land. God is able to hop into his wheeled chariot and enter into this new temple. And not only that, the final vision of Ezekiel is, as the video said, it's a vision of water flowing from the temple, abundant trees growing beside the river, food being provided for the people, evoking the scene in Genesis 2 about the stream rising from the earth to water the whole face of the ground, about the trees that are provided in Genesis 2 and the food that is provided for human beings. And then not only that wonderful ecological vision right near the end in chapter 47, but an affirmation that Israel will be a broad and inclusive society, because the aliens who reside among you shall be to you as citizens of Israel. In whatever tribe the aliens are residing, there you shall assign them their inheritance. So an openness to refugees coming into the people of Israel in their land from other places. So there's this really broad, expansive vision towards the end of Ezekiel, both in terms of human beings in society and in terms of the whole ecology of the earth. So we had questions there for you to consider, and those questions are in your resource notes about how this offers hope for Israel in exile, and also hope for human beings in the 21st century. And what do we need to do to ensure this vision becomes a reality? And you'll be happy to know, those of you who have With Love to the World, this is one of the passages that I've picked for a bit later on in the season of creation, to reflect on the vision of the river flowing out from the temple through the land. So you've got that ahead of you. Well, 48 chapters of Ezekiel, and we've touched on 3 or 4 of them. So I think we've done well. Next week, we are moving from the exile, looking to and moving into the return to the land. And so we return to the book of the prophet Isaiah, or should that be the book of the prophets Isaiah, because we're looking at the second main section, often called Deutero-Isaiah. That's chapters 40 to 55. And there's a few passages there for you to read. And if you read them, you will see why they are being suggested. They all resonate with New Testament stuff. This and then the latter part of the Trito-Isaiah, the third part of Isaiah, are really the parts of Isaiah that pop up again and again and again in our New Testament scriptures.